The way I think about this is thinking about who's going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers of the new victorious campaign. So among the winners, again, you have this very diverse coalition with all kinds of different interests. And among the losers, you're going to have losers. You always have losers. There's no such thing so far as some kind of utopian outcome where we've never seen anybody lose in these types of campaigns. There's always losers. And the question is, what happens to these deposed elites, or people that are loyal to those deposed elites, who also themselves have diverse interests and more or less would like not to be completely excommunicated from this society? So what do we do with all these diverse groups? Now, political scientists have just started to think more robustly about these types of dynamics, but the field has actually been largely motivated by what you might call structural determinants of democracy. So for example, one of the most cited reasons of explaining why democratic transitions work is based on economic development. So there's a really powerful finding by some scholars named Jaworski and Limouji, who found that once a country has transitioned to democracy, it's never backslided into authoritarianism if the average GDP per capita is above 12,500 US dollars. So there's a base level of economic development that many people think is kind of a necessary threshold for democratic success. Now, some countries have survived without that, but their argument is that some basic level of economic development is necessary. Why do you think that would be the case? The second thing that a lot of structural theorists argue is necessary is that these campaigns, or these countries have some kind of laws, really robust laws against political and economic discrimination. Now, of course, a critique against this is, why would leaders, elites in countries, especially authoritarian countries, create laws against political and economic discrimination? They usually don't do those things voluntarily. So this whole field hasn't really seen social movements emerging in the context of these kinds of legal institutional structures. And then the third thing is that apparently if you're a former British colony as opposed to a former Portuguese colony or a former French colony, you're more likely to be democratic. We have no real reason for explaining this, and it may actually not hold in recent years. I haven't gone back and looked at the more recent collapses. But I want to turn our attention to some other kind of interesting findings about the way that civic life and the way we associate with one another on just common bases might actually create a better quality of democracy. So there's this guy named Robert Putnam. Has anybody heard of Robert Putnam? Okay, so some of you have heard of him. That's awesome. He's a Harvard political scientist who I think is brilliant, not mostly for his books, but for the fact that he got an NSF grant to live in a Tuscan villa for 2 years and study Italian democracy. Pretty smart guy, right? And his study was created into a book called Making Democracy Work. And in this book, what he did was he looked at Italian democracy in the North, which he portrayed as highly functional and really robust and responsive. And he compared it to Italian democracy in the South, which he said was highly corrupt and full of pizzo transactions and the things that Shaska illuminated us with earlier today. And Putnam's main question was, why does democracy work so well in northern Italy and not in the South? And what he did was he spent 2 years eating amazing pasta and going around the country. And what he did was sort of household surveys and other things to find out what is it that people in the North do in their lives that's different from people in the South. And the main finding he came up with is that they're really civically engaged. Like, they do stuff like this, right? They meet and talk about the future of their society on a regular basis. They talk with their neighbors. When they have friends over for dinner, politics is not a taboo subject. It's like the subject of the meal, right? And there's arguing. It's not that they're meeting with people that agree with them. They're actually meeting with people that disagree with them. And it's quite common cultural practice to get in these types of conversations. The average household subscribes to like 3 to 5 newspapers and periodicals. They are highly engaged in civic clubs and organizations. and even sporting leagues. So it makes people pay attention to elections. There's very high voter turnout. There's a lot of mobilization around the polls and so forth. And the argument is, this creates a pretty responsive and efficient government, such as it is in Italy. No offense to anybody. And then in the South, you have a situation where there's basically two social institutions, the mafia and the church. But other than that, people were not civically engaged. In fact, they were quite deliberately disengaged, in part because it was too dangerous to be engaged, but also because of feelings of apathy and the lack of empowerment. So no newspaper subscriptions, would rather really not read about the news, actually. No civic organizations and clubs. It's church, and it's the mafia, and it's not a lot else. Now, he kind of updated this study in a more popular version of his book, which he called Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone is the version you'd want to read, unless you were an academic and liked the really nerdy stuff. And in that book, what he talks about is, actually, he refers to American democracy, and he says that democracy and the quality of democracy in the United States is actually on the decline because people don't play together anymore. His book is called Bowling Alone because in the 1950s, Americans all belonged to bowling leagues. Do you know what bowling leagues are? Okay. Yeah, anyway, I could say a lot about that. But they were involved in bowling leagues and all kinds of extracurricular sports and activities and clubs and civic groups and so forth. And it was actually not taboo to talk about politics over dinner. It was really similar to what he was describing in northern Italy, but that now people only select into groups where they talk to people who share their political beliefs because it's too uncomfortable and in fact considered somewhat taboo to engage in these types of conversations in polite company. Also, we go bowling by ourselves. We don't join bowling leagues anymore. We sit at home and play video games on the internet rather than going out and playing soccer in the field with our friends. So his argument is that this is going to degrade the quality of American democracies. Now, if you take the social capital thesis of Putnam's argument and you apply it to civil resistance, what we can see is that civil resistance is almost like social capital on steroids, right? Because not only are people openly confronting and disputing political conversations and ideas, but they are doing so in a very high stakes, high risk situation that might even create much tighter social bonds than this sort of more ordinary type of social capital might do. And as a result of that, my argument is that, and in the book with Maria, what we hypothesized was that these social capital mechanisms would be really ramped up in moments of civil insurrection. And because of that, we would start to see those same mechanisms of democratic accountability and responsiveness in countries emerging from civil resistance campaigns compared with countries that didn't. So here's a chart with some of the data about this. The horizontal axis is a 21-point scale called the polity scale. Has anybody heard of the polity scale? Okay, so this is a data set that political scientists used basically to index whether a country is a democracy, a totalitarian regime, or something in between. So -10 is a totalitarian regime or an absolute monarchy. A +10 is an advanced democracy. And really, most political scientists will say that a +7 or higher is pretty much an advanced democracy. A -7 or lower is an authoritarian regime, and then sort of this -5 to +5 region here or there is what we call anocracies or hybrid countries. They have some features of democracy and some features of authoritarianism, and these are based on their procedures, their constitution, their procedures for competition for the executive, whether they have checks and balances and so forth. So it's an index. And the horizontal scale here is showing you the adjusted predicted probability that the country will be a +7 or higher 5 years after the campaign is over. So in other words, that it will be a democracy 5 years after the campaign is over. I say it's the adjusted predicted probability because what we did was we looked at all the other factors that prior scholars have said impact whether a country is democratic or not. So we looked at things like GDP per capita. We looked at the region of the world, whether it was a British colony, whether it had some forms of discrimination, the population size, the neighborhood. We looked at all of the different determinants of democracy. And then we looked at, if you hold those things constant and you basically group these countries by whether they had a nonviolent campaign or whether they had a violent campaign, what's the effect? So what we can see on the left is the violent campaigns. And for those that had, that were authoritarian regimes, that's like a -5 to a -10, a year before the campaign was over, you can see that there's virtually no probability that they're going to be a democracy after. From the -5 to 5, you can see that the probability starts to increase. The max is around 20%. So 1 in 5 countries that's kind of a weak state, hybrid regime that faces a violent insurgency becomes a democracy later. And then the really scary part actually is right up at the top of the scale. The democracies that fight armed insurrections are only about 50% likely to remain so 5 years after the campaign is over. Does that make sense? What that means is about 50% of them are not likely to be democracies 5 years after the campaign ends. That is, democracies don't survive armed insurrections. Even if they defeat the armed insurrections, they backslide into authoritarianism. So if you look on the right side, what you see is a totally different picture where even for authoritarian regimes, those countries that are on the -10 to -5 scale, you can already see that there's like a 5 or 6 times higher probability that they emerge democratic after the campaign ends. For the middling regimes, you can see that now we're really seeing kind of an exponential impact. And then for those countries that are democratic and that face a nonviolent campaign, almost all of them remain so. You can see that almost half of violent campaigns experience another civil war within the next 10 years. And those are major civil wars. That's over 1,000 people killed per year in the Civil War. So it's not, low-level conflict or something. And then nonviolent campaigns are just under 30% likely. So it's a significant difference. There are also indicators. This is from a doctoral thesis by a woman named Judith Stoddard at Rutgers, Newark. And she was just doing a very simple count of different sorts of indicators of personal well-being, human development indicators after these different campaigns. And she actually found that on a variety of different measures, things like infant mortality, GDP per capita, and things like that, that nonviolent campaigns were basically leaving behind countries in a much better position. And one of the best welfare or well-being measures is life expectancy. So here are the life expectancy counts. And what you can see here is that, as I mentioned yesterday, if you have a successful armed campaign, the infrastructural damage is such that compared to world averages, life expectancies post-conflict drop through the floor. That's what that effect is showing us there on that slide. And if you look at places where nonviolent campaigns have been successful, you can see that even relative to the world average, they're above it. So they're actually improving well-being after the campaign is over relative to global averages.